Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opus Partners. I'm your host, Ted McKnight.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today's show, we're talking about houses versus townhouses versus apartments. Which takes the longest to sell? And there's been a couple of questions that have come through on Instagram. Firstly, asking, do townhouses and apartments take longer to sell compared to a house? But then also, do townhouses in larger developments take longer to sell compared to townhouses in smaller developments? So we've spent quite a few hours digging through the data and we've got some interesting findings for you. So Andrew, which does take longer to sell, a house, a townhouse or an apartment?
So apartments do take the longest to sell. And if we look at Auckland first of all, houses on average take 42 days to sell. Apartments take 53, so an extra 11 days.
About a week and a half,
eh? And townhouses are right smack bang in the middle at 47 days.
Yeah, and that's over the last 12 months on average what we've seen. Now, that's Auckland, but what about the rest of the country?
Yeah, this is where it gets quite interesting. So if you go to Wellington, houses take an average of 41 days, so pretty much the same. Townhouses actually sell slightly faster at 39 days.
Yeah, and
Does that surprise you?
A little bit, actually, but I was thinking about, this is specifically Wellington City, so not the Hutt Valley, not Porirua. I'm not sure how many townhouses are actually there, but
There's a few.
okay, well, they are selling slightly quicker. Perhaps it's because they're more affordable.
Yeah, I guess so.
We're going to do a podcast, just so you know, on do cheaper houses sell more quickly?
Yeah, okay.
That'll be an interesting one for next week.
Apartments, and there's a lot of apartments in Wellington Central, they take a lot longer at 52 days, but similar to Auckland.
But interesting that, same as Auckland, it's an extra 11 days.
Yeah.
41 days for a house, 52 days for an apartment, roughly an extra week and a half.
It's not meaningful. It's not like it's several months. 11 days is not the end of the world, is it?
Well, it's a really important point that you make around degree, right? Because I think sometimes when people say, does a townhouse take longer to sell or does an apartment take longer to sell? The answer in this case is yes, but are those extra 11 days meaningful? Now, some people will look at that data and say, well, I want to be able to sell a property as quick as possible. Actually, that makes a big difference for me. Myself, when I look at that data and say, well, in Auckland, a townhouse takes an extra 5 days, an apartment extra 11 days, and Christchurch is a bit different. We'll look at that data in a second. For me, that's not that meaningful.
No. Christchurch, so houses 33 days, so it's quite a lot faster than Auckland and Wellington. Townhouses an extra 4 days, so hardly significant there. Apartments, again, 55 days, which is really interesting.
That's 3 weeks.
Yes, so still about the same length of time as it takes to sell an apartment in Wellington or Auckland, but significantly longer compared to houses or townhouses in Christchurch.
Do you think that's just because there's not that many apartments in Christchurch?
I think it's partly that, and partly I think Cantabrians are a bit more conservative in what they buy. I don't think we're as familiar or desire apartments as much as Wellington or Auckland.
Yeah, okay, I think that makes sense. But an extra 3 weeks there to sell an apartment compared to a house in Christchurch, that might be more meaningful for somebody when they're looking at that data. So the first thing is, it does appear that that townhouses and apartments take slightly longer to sell compared to a house.
And one of the things, so just thinking about why that might be, it might be that, again, there are fewer buyers for apartments in different regions, for example, but it also might be that you have to do a little bit more due diligence around apartments. So with an apartment, you have to go through the body corporate rules. Your lawyer's going to have to consult on that. You're likely to have more questions. So it could just be that it takes a couple more weeks to do due diligence.
Yeah, that's a fair point, actually. The other thing I'm interested in is how does that compare over time? So right now it's taking an extra, say, week and a half to sell an apartment in Auckland, but what's it been over the last 30 years? And what's really interesting is if we go back to 2000, we were seeing it took about 100 days to sell an apartment on average, whereas it only took about 44 days to sell a house and about 48 days to sell a townhouse. And what's interesting, when I just look at the data, it appears that apartments are a little bit more volatile. So houses and townhouses, they kind of follow roughly the same number of days. Sometimes it's a bit quicker to sell a townhouse. Sometimes it takes a bit longer. But houses and townhouses kind of move together. On average, it takes a few more days to sell a townhouse. But apartments, sometimes it takes way longer to sell an apartment. Even if we look more recently, at the start of 2021, it took 52 days on average to sell an apartment, whereas it took under 40 days to sell both a house and a townhouse. So it's a little bit more volatile. Sometimes it can take longer to sell an apartment. So maybe a little bit more risk there.
It's certainly closed over time, I would think. And so the interesting thing about that is, again, maybe we've become more familiar with apartments. Lawyers have become more familiar with them. Banks have become more familiar with them. We're less scared to buy one.
Yeah, and again, it does come back to degree. So, if we were saying that like an apartment takes longer to sell than a house, and it was 5 months longer, so maybe it took a month to sell a house, and it took 5 or 6 months to sell an apartment. That's where you'd probably say, I'm really worried about resale value. As a property investor, maybe I'm not going to buy an apartment. But if you say, well, it's an extra week, it's an extra 2 weeks, at most in Christchurch, it's an extra 3 weeks, that's where you might say, well, time to sell isn't going to be my largest concern. It's not highest on my priority list. I'm actually going to look at some other data now that I know that it's not too much of a concern. But the next thing that I'm really interested in was this question around, well, does the number of units matter? So let's say that there are 2 townhouse developments. There's one with 100 units and there's one with 10 units. Is it going to take longer to sell a property in the townhouse development with 100 units? And what's the kind of thinking there? Why do people think that a townhouse in a development of 100 units might take longer to sell?
Well, you just got more competition. So let's think about, if you got 100 other people that you might be competing with when you put your property, or 99 other people when you put your property on the market, does that mean that you're going to be competing against this one, and so therefore yours is not going to sell as quickly?
Yeah, but it's quite hard to get this kind of data, right?
Yeah, correct. So the challenging part is, if you're a real estate agent and you're loading a sale in a development, you'll put the address. So it might be 28 bar 36 Kennedine Road, but you don't necessarily say that's one unit of 100. And so digging into the data, we kind of have to go into actually looking at a whole development. So we did that.
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to get precise data, right? Because a real estate agent doesn't say, oh yeah, it's 2 bar 3 Smith Street and there are 20 units in there. So it's not reported and really easy to get. Just before we look at an individual development, I did think about, what's one way we could get some more data about this, and we'll have a go at it, Andrew. So at first I looked at 2 suburbs where there are a really high proportion of townhouses. So Hobsonville in Auckland and West Harbour in Auckland. Each of them, about 50 to 60% of the properties are townhouses. So we've got 2 suburbs that have a lot of townhouses in them. And then I thought, well, let's look at an area that's next to it. And I'm looking at Waitakere in Auckland, which is a larger ward, that doesn't have as many townhouses, about 20%. So we've got 2 suburbs with a lot of townhouses in them, and we've got one area with not as many townhouses. And the way that I thought we could test this is saying, well, if having a lot of townhouses means more competition, means takes longer to sell, Hobsonville and West Harbour townhouses should take longer to sell than townhouses in Waitakere.
Yes, okay, gotcha.
So the places with lots of townhouses, those townhouses should take longer to sell than this other area with not a lot of townhouses. Because there's less competition, those townhouses should sell more quickly. And so I thought, well, let's see if that's the case. It's not a perfect way to test it, but it could give us a sense. And when we see it, Andrew, this is the first time you're seeing this, does it take substantially longer to sell a townhouse in Hobsonville or West Harbour compared to Waitakere?
No, and see, I mean, again, you can see some obvious gaps in some of the times that people were selling, but by and large, it's pretty much the same.
Yeah, if you average it out over about 30 years, I think it takes an extra 2 or 3 days to sell a townhouse in those suburbs with lots of townhouses compared to Waitakere.
See, I mean, again, I can understand the rationale of thinking, if there's more competition, it's going to take longer to sell. But if there's more competition, it might very well be that also that's what people are looking for in those areas. So if you're moving to Hobsonville, you probably want a townhouse.
That's because it's chock full of townhouses and it's a different type of lifestyle. Interesting enough, townhouses in Waitakere at the moment are taking about 54 days to sell on average. Townhouses in those places where there are just more townhouses, West Harbour is about 48, and Hobsonville is about the same, maybe slightly more at 49. So the place where there's lots of townhouses at the moment, where there's lots of competition, are actually selling more quickly than an area where there's fewer townhouses.
But also, if you've got more townhouses, your infrastructure is probably built to suit that lifestyle. So you've probably got more common areas like parks and playgrounds, more shops and stuff that are convenience stores. You're probably set up as more of a community feel where you are going to be living in a townhouse compared to, again, you might have a townhouse. Like, you remember we spoke about those townhouses in Pegasus at one stage where it just really wasn't suitable for the type of tenant that was going to live out there. And so they didn't sell very well.
Yeah, so just for anybody who isn't from Canterbury, Pegasus was like a brand new town that was built maybe 30 minutes, 20 minutes from Christchurch.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, that's what I said, 30 minutes from Christchurch.
Yeah, but then you said 20 minutes and got me confused. But 40 minutes from town.
Yeah, and so that's where people are going to move out there because they want a cheaper house. And they're not going to want to live in a townhouse out there. But this is not a perfect way to test that theory that larger developments will take longer to sell than townhouses and smaller developments. So we've actually got to look at a specific one. And for this, we are going to look at Hamilton, aren't we? We're going to look at one on Cameron Road in Hamilton. Why have we chosen this one, Andrew?
Well, because this was built in 2014, so we've got a good length of time, and because they've been there for about 9 years. 90 properties in total, so relatively large development, particularly for Hamilton. Like that would be, medium to large in Auckland. So in Hamilton, it's definitely quite a dense development. They're almost all 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. Some have 2 bedrooms, but most of them are the 3 bedrooms. So they're all pretty much the same. So an investor might think, how the hell am I going to sell this if I'm going to be competing with everyone else? Surely I'm going to be competing with someone else when I sell this property.
And so what I wanted to look at is, well, how many of these 90 properties actually sell per year? Because this could get us a sense of, well, how much competition might I have? Now, Andrew, if I was just to ask you to ballpark it, how many of those 90 properties do you think sell per year?
So the way I would do this is I'd say, okay, let's imagine that everyone holds for the average length of time. Now, obviously, this is slightly flawed because that means that in 7 years, everyone's selling their property. But 7 years is the average time that people hold a property in New Zealand. So if you divide 90 by 7, that works out to be about 13. So it means one person selling every month, roughly.
So we've dug through the numbers, and about 5 to 6 properties sell per year in that development. Now, the year where the most properties sold, there were 11 property sales out of that 90 development in 1 year. But what's interesting about that was it was in 2014. So that was the same year that these properties were built. So what could have happened is some investors signed a contract to buy it, they got built, and then they sold them on. Or maybe the developer held some of them back and then decided to sell. So not unusual that you might see a lot of sales activity the year that they are actually built.
Isn't that interesting that on average it's about half of what I was expecting?
Yeah, so you thought 13 and you were wrong every single year. 5 to 6 is more usual. The other most popular year for selling properties in that Chiefs Court development was 2020. So that was in the property market boom, about 10 properties selling. But of course, if you're selling in a property market boom, it's not going to take you as long to sell. In 2023, there were only 2 properties sold that year. In 2019, only 3 properties sold per year. So it does vary, but 2 to 8 property sales per year is pretty usual. So that's somewhere between 1 every 6 months to 1 every 1.5 months, call it. So the first thing to think about when you're thinking about like a townhouse in a big development is not everything's selling all at once. If you're selling in 2023 and there are only 2 transactions and, maybe somebody lists their property and they don't end up selling it, so they withdraw it from the market, there might not be as much competition as people think, at least not in this case study. And then it's interesting, we can actually jump into the back end of Property Guru and take a look at all of the property sales and just see how long some of them lasted. So for example, let's just click into a random one, Andrew, and we'll go into 63 Chiefs Court. I was looking at this before, and we can see, well, how long was that actually on the market for? And if we zoom in, so that was listed in May 2022.
23 days.
It went for 23 days on the market and was listed at $629. Ended up selling for $605K. Discount of $24,000, that's probably what you'd expect by the time you start negotiating. 23 days on the market is pretty
Really
short
fast.
all up. And let's just choose another one. Let's look at 18 Chiefs Court. Again, another 3-bed, 1-bath property there. And that one ended up selling for $599. Oh, interestingly.
Same agent.
Same agent, but and same year, slightly earlier, March 2022, listed for sale at $599, sold for $599, 26 days on the market. I kind of look at those numbers and think, okay, it's in a large development of 90 properties. They're selling quite quickly. The selling prices are relatively close to asking, in this case, bang on asking. So at least in this case study, I'm not seeing any evidence that buying in a larger development necessarily means it's going to take substantially longer. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some people, and I'm sure if I looked through every single property sale in here, I think I actually did see one that was a bit longer than that. But it also it always depends on, well, is your selling price what you think you're going to sell it for? Is that realistic? Do you have a good agent? Those are the factors that are potentially going to have a bigger impact on how quickly you can sell a property compared to how many properties are actually within that development. So I think it's a good chat. I think you can understand why somebody say a property in a larger development, that's going to take way longer to sell. But when we look at this specific case study, properties are selling pretty quickly. Might take a bit longer to sell a townhouse, 5 days potentially in Auckland at the moment compared to a house, but potentially not very substantial.
And I think this is a good example of where sometimes investors, particularly new investors, can maybe just get fixated on the wrong thing, and we talk ourselves into these ideas like there's going to be a whole lot more competition. And don't get me wrong, I've been there. I've made those kind of thoughts in my head. Lucky I've got an economist that just proves me wrong all the time.
It basically just makes me so happy when you say something and then I can prove you wrong with some numbers. But the main thing is, I'm not saying that an apartment or a townhouse will always sell the same as a house, because the data doesn't suggest that. It might take an extra 5 days. It might take an extra 7 days in an area with lots and lots of townhouses. In some instances, it might take an extra couple of days. But the question or the decision that we all need to make is, well, how consequential is that for us? Where should it be on our priority list, and how much of a concern are we going to let it be? Because perhaps there are some other things like buying in an area that's undervalued or overvalued. That's going to be something that's going to be higher on my priority list. What sort of property is it? If it's got 1 bedroom, I'm probably not buying it, because 1-bedroom properties don't increase in value as quickly. How quickly have property prices increased in that specific suburb in the past? If I'm buying in an area that's increase in value really quickly, that's more important to me. So everything's about where should things be on your priority list, and hopefully this just gives you the data so you can make that decision for yourself. Yeah. Right, let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. And hey, if you're listening to the podcast and you want to see some of the graphs we're sharing, just Google Opus Partners YouTube will be the first thing that comes up, and you can actually see the graphs and the visuals. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe. We release new videos every Monday and Wednesday. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight. We're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.